Entire cities can be erased from the map in a single night. This is the haunting reality behind 15 ancient disasters that wiped out entire civilizations. By the end of this journey, you will understand the fragile forces that separate human achievement from total oblivion. What could make a society as sophisticated as the Minoans simply vanish? How does a changing sky topple empires that once fed millions? We will travel from the sunken ruins of a Greek city to the silent, towering temples of the Maya, uncovering how earthquakes, plagues, and climatic shifts brought the mightiest cultures to their knees. This exploration reveals more than forgotten history. It offers a sobering lens on our own world's resilience. What do you believe is the greatest threat to our civilization today? The true scale of these events defies simple explanation. We are not talking about a single season of drought or a lost battle, but a fundamental unraveling. A civilization-ending catastrophe occurs when multiple systems fail at once, creating a trap with no exit. It is the environmental shock that withers the crops, combined with the social fracture that prevents a coordinated response, layered with the external pressure that exploits that newfound weakness. Historians often describe a framework of 5 interconnected stresses: environmental damage, climate change, hostile neighbors, loss of vital trading partners, and perhaps most critically, a society's own rigid or failed response to the crisis. Alone, any one of these might be a severe challenge, a test of resilience, but when they arrive together, they form a perfect storm that can erase centuries of cultural memory and technological achievement. As we explore these 15 ancient disasters, watch for this deadly convergence. You will see how a changing climate could push a society toward conflict, how that conflict could sever lifelines of trade, and how a rigid leadership clinging to old ways could miss the window for adaptation entirely. This framework is not just a tool for understanding the past, it is a sobering checklist for our own future, a reminder that our complex world is woven from the same fragile threads. The first thread to unravel in our story is a geological cataclysm of almost unimaginable scale. Around the year 1600 before the Common Era, the Mediterranean island of Thera, which we know today as Santorini, ceased to be a single landmass. The volcano at its heart did not simply erupt, it detonated. The energy released is calculated to have been many times more powerful than the famous Krakatoa eruption of the 19th century, a blast heard thousands of miles away. For the brilliant Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, just 70 miles to the south, this was not a distant rumble, it was the beginning of the end. The immediate aftermath was a sequence of horrors. First, the sea itself turned against them. The collapse of the volcano's core into the emptied magma chamber sent a titanic wave racing across the open water. When it reached the northern coast of Crete, this tsunami was not a large wave. It was a mountain of water, estimated to be over 100 feet high. It scoured the coastline clean, obliterating the vital ports and the sophisticated fleet that were the lifeblood of Minoan trade and power. In moments, their dominance of the seas was washed away. Then the sky fell. A towering plume of ash and pumice, carried by the winds, descended upon Crete like a gray, suffocating blanket. It covered fields, choked waterways, and blotted out the sun. This was not a temporary inconvenience, it triggered a volcanic winter. Temperatures dropped, growing seasons failed, and the once fertile land that supported their vibrant culture could no longer feed its people. The economic foundation of the society, a complex system of agriculture and maritime exchange, collapsed under this 1-2 punch from the ocean and the atmosphere. It is crucial to understand that the Minoans did not disappear overnight. Their grand palaces, like Knossos with its legendary labyrinth, still stood. But they were a civilization in shock, gravely wounded. Their power was shattered, their food supply precarious, and their once secure island world suddenly felt very small and vulnerable. This profound weakness created an opening. Within a few generations, the Mycenaeans from the Greek mainland, perhaps once trading partners or rivals, moved in. The dazzling Minoan culture, with its graceful frescoes and peaceful, sea-focused life, faded, absorbed and overwritten, becoming the stuff of later Greek legend. The fury of Thera shows us with stunning clarity how a single, violent geological event can act as a detonator, setting off a chain reaction of environmental, economic, and political failures from which even the most advanced society may not recover. The story of Thera is one of sudden, violent transformation, but not all endings arrive with a roar. Sometimes a civilization's demise comes with a whisper, a slow, relentless withdrawal of the most fundamental resource of all. Around 1,900 years before the Common Era, in the vast, fertile plains of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, the great cities of the Indus Valley civilization began to quiet. This was not the work of invading armies or a single cataclysm, but a creeping, insidious change in the very sky above them. The Harappan people had built one of the ancient world's most astonishing societies, celebrated for its brilliant urban planning with standardized bricks, sophisticated drainage, and public baths that spoke of a deep concern for communal well-being. Their cities, like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were marvels of order and harmony, yet their entire existence was anchored to a delicate, life-giving system, the monsoon rains and the great rivers they fed. Mounting evidence from sediment cores and geological studies points to a prolonged and severe drought that gripped the region for centuries. The monsoon patterns, which had reliably delivered nourishing rains, began to shift and weaken. The consequences were devastatingly simple. The mighty Saraswati River, described in later texts as a powerful stream, likely began to dwindle, becoming a series of seasonal ponds before fading into the desert sands. The Indus itself may have grown erratic, its course shifting away from the fields and cities that depended on it. Imagine the slow, year-by-year anxiety as the wells ran a little drier, as the harvests grew a little thinner, as the once reliable riverbanks receded further into the distance. This was a disaster measured not in moments but in generations. Without reliable water, the intricate agricultural system that fed hundreds of thousands of people began to fail. The economic and social glue that held such complex urban life together started to dissolve. There is no evidence of a sudden, violent overthrow. Instead, archaeologists see a story of gradual abandonment. People left the grand, orderly cities not all at once, but in a slow trickle over decades. They dispersed into smaller, more manageable villages, retreating to a simpler way of life that was less vulnerable to large-scale environmental change. The great urban experiment, with its writing system and standardized weights, faded from memory, its secrets buried for millennia beneath the dust. The lesson of the Indus Valley is a haunting one. It shows how a civilization at its peak can be undone not by a dramatic enemy, but by a silent, shifting climate. Their story is a powerful reminder that our greatest vulnerabilities may not be the sudden blows, but the slow, persistent pressures that test our adaptability over the long arc of time. The silence that fell over the Mycenaean world was not an empty one. It was filled with the echoes of collapsing systems. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, the great palace citadels of Mycenae, Pylos, and Turins, the very seats of power for legendary kings like Agamemnon, were consumed by fire and then abandoned. This was not a conquest by a single, identifiable enemy, but something far more insidious and complex, a phenomenon historians call a systems collapse. Imagine a network of vital threads, environmental, economic, military, and social, all pulled tight. When one thread snaps, the strain multiplies across the entire web until the whole structure gives way. For the Mycenaeans, the first threat was likely the climate. A prolonged period of severe drought settled over the eastern Mediterranean. Crops failed, harvests dwindled, and the specter of famine began to stalk the land. A centralized palace economy which collected and redistributed grain could not function when the storehouses were empty. This internal hardship bred desperation and social unrest, weakening the authority of the Wanax, the Mycenaean king. Into this power vacuum swarmed new pressures. From the sea came waves of raiders and migrants, groups the ancient Egyptians mysteriously recorded as the Sea Peoples. They were less a unified army and more a symptom of the wider regional chaos, desperate groups on the move, perhaps fleeing their own environmental crises. They found the Mycenaean coasts poorly defended, their once mighty warriors distracted by hunger and internal strife. At the same time, the lifelines of commerce began to sever. The intricate long-distance trade networks that brought tin from as far away as Afghanistan, essential for making bronze, collapsed. Without bronze, you could not forge new weapons or tools. The military and economic engine of the society sputtered to a halt. What followed was a domino effect with no one left to stop it. Famine led to rebellion, rebellion invited invasion, invasion destroyed trade, and the loss of trade made recovery impossible. The grand bureaucratic system, with its linear B tablets recording inventories of chariots and textiles, became irrelevant. The people dispersed from the burned palaces, retreating to isolated villages. Writing was forgotten, art became simpler, and the memory of the palatial age faded into the myths of a later time, like Homer's tales of the Trojan War. The Mycenaean collapse is a masterclass in interconnected fragility. It shows us that a civilization's greatest strength, its complex, centralized systems, can become its greatest vulnerability when multiple shocks arrive at once. The end came not with a single dramatic blow, but with the silent, simultaneous failure of everything that held the world together. High on the sun-baked cliffs of Mesa Verde, the silence holds a profound question. For centuries, the ancestral Puebloans thrived in this demanding landscape, carving entire cities into the sandstone alcoves, a testament to human ingenuity. Then, by the close of the 13th century, they walked away, leaving behind empty towers and silent plazas. Their departure was not a sudden flight, but the final act in a long, slow struggle against a changing sky. The true scale of the disaster is written in the rings of ancient trees. Dendrochronology, the science of tree ring dating, reveals a grim story. A megadrought that clenched the southwest for generations, not just a few dry years. This was a climatic shift that redefined the meaning of hardship. For a civilization built on the precarious cultivation of maize in an arid land, it was a death sentence for their way of life. The cornfields, carefully tended in valleys below the cliffs, withered under the relentless sun. Springs and streams, the vital arteries of the community, dwindled to muddy trickles and then vanished entirely. The careful balance between population and resources maintained for so long was shattered. As the drought tightened its grip, the social fabric began to fray. The very architecture of their society, those spectacular, defensible cliff dwellings, tells a later chapter of the story. While originally built for shelter and community, their elevated, difficult-to-access locations suggest a growing need for security. With survival at stake, competition for the last reliable water sources and fertile patches of land likely turned neighbors into rivals. Tensions that might have been resolved in times of plenty could escalate into conflict when every resource meant the difference between life and a community's end. This was not a war of conquest, but a desperate struggle born of scarcity. Faced with the impossible choice of staying and facing continued hunger and strife, the people made a collective decision. They did not vanish from the earth. In a remarkable act of resilience, they chose migration. Clan by clan, family by family, they descended from their magnificent stone cities and embarked on a great dispersal. They moved south and east, joining existing communities like the Hopi and the Zuni, integrating their knowledge and traditions with new groups. Their cultural identity transformed and persisted, but their unique architectural achievement, that specific chapter of building cities in cliffs, came to a definitive close. The story of the ancestral Puebloans is a powerful lesson in adaptation. It shows a civilization not wiped out, but dissolved by environmental pressure, choosing to reform its very essence elsewhere. Their empty dwellings stand not as tombs, but as monuments to a difficult choice, a reminder that sometimes a society's greatest act of endurance is knowing when to leave and having the wisdom to carry its spirit forward to a new home. The stone faces of Angkor Wat gaze out with an eternal serenity, but their view changed forever. For over 5 centuries, the Khmer Empire was the undisputed power of Southeast Asia, its wealth and might flowing from an astonishing feat of engineering, a vast hydraulic city. Angkor was not just a collection of temples, it was a meticulously designed landscape, a machine for living, built to tame the monsoon. Elaborate canals, massive reservoirs called barrays, and intricate networks of moats and channels captured precious rainwater, redistributing it to support intensive rice cultivation and sustain a population that may have approached 1 million. This system was their lifeblood and their crowning achievement, a testament to human ingenuity bending nature to its will. Yet, the very sophistication of this network contained a hidden fragility. Recent discoveries using airborne laser scanning, known as lidar, have peeled back the jungle canopy to reveal the stunning scale of this engineered landscape, but also its ultimate failure. Sediment cores drilled from the ancient barrays and moats tell a story of climatic betrayal. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the region was rocked by a violent climatic swing. First came a period of extraordinarily intense monsoon rains, likely far beyond what the system was designed to handle. Canals overflowed, reservoirs breached, and the carefully leveled rice paddies were inundated with silt and debris. The engineering marvel built to manage water was suddenly overwhelmed by it. Then the pendulum swung the other way. The intense rains gave way to prolonged and severe droughts. The massive reservoirs, now silted up and damaged, could not hold the dwindling water supply. The network that had once ensured abundance now delivered only scarcity. The rice fields that fed the empire starved for water. This environmental shock reverberated through every layer of Khmer society. A ruling elite whose legitimacy was based on controlling the water, and thus the harvests found their power evaporating alongside the reservoirs. The central authority at Angkor weakened as regional lords sought their own solutions. At the same time, the empire's economic landscape was shifting. Maritime trade routes were gaining prominence, bypassing the inland capital and diminishing its commercial importance. The combination was devastating, a failing environmental infrastructure coupled with a fading economic reason to maintain it. The abandonment of Angkor was not a single catastrophic event, but a gradual strategic retreat. The court eventually moved its center of power south, closer to the coast and these new trade networks, leaving the magnificent stone heart of the empire to the embrace of the jungle. The lesson of the Khmer is a profound one in technological hubris. It shows that a system optimized for a specific climate can become a trap when that climate changes. Their greatest strength, the engineered landscape, became a colossal liability, a monument to the sobering truth that our most brilliant solutions must be flexible enough to survive the world we cannot fully control. A microscopic stowaway changed the fate of an empire. In the year 541, as the Byzantine Empire under Emperor Justinian reached its greatest territorial extent since the fall of Rome, a silent passenger arrived in the bustling grain ships from Egypt. Hidden in the fur of rats and the bites of fleas was the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the agent of bubonic plague. What began as a strange illness in the port of Pelusium soon became a biological firestorm, racing through the crowded streets of Constantinople and across the interconnected world of the Mediterranean. This was the Plague of Justinian, and it demonstrated with terrifying clarity that a civilization's most formidable enemy could be invisible. The scale of the loss is almost beyond comprehension. Contemporary accounts describe a city brought to its knees. The historian Procopius, who witnessed the horror, wrote of bodies piled in the streets and a silence broken only by the cries of the grieving. The plague did not discriminate, affecting people from all walks of life. In a single year, it is estimated that tens of millions perished across the empire and beyond, a mortality rate that may have reached half the population in some regions. This was not merely a tragic loss of life, it was a systematic dismantling of a society's operating system. Farmers in the fields fell ill, causing harvests to fail and triggering widespread hunger. Soldiers in the armies Justinian had assembled to reclaim lost provinces like Italy and North Africa succumbed, halting military campaigns in their tracks. The intricate networks of trade that fueled the empire's economy seized up as ports emptied and merchants avoided afflicted cities. The immediate paralysis was devastating, but the long-term consequences reshaped the map of the world. Justinian's grand project of reuniting the Roman Empire was permanently derailed. The empire, bled white by depopulation and economic collapse, could no longer muster the resources to hold its reconquered territories. Italy, a jewel in the imperial crown, slipped from Byzantine control within a generation, opening the door for other powers. The profound weakening of both the Byzantine and Persian empires, which were locked in a centuries-long struggle, created a power vacuum in the Near East. Into this void, just a century later, would come a new dynamic force: the early Islamic expansions. The plague had so thoroughly exhausted the traditional powers that they could offer little effective resistance to this new political and spiritual movement. This disaster forces us to confront a different kind of historical force. While earthquakes and droughts test a society's infrastructure and adaptability, a pandemic attacks its very biological foundation, its people. The Plague of Justinian shows that human history is not driven solely by kings, armies, or climate, but also by the unseen, microscopic world. A pathogen, moving along the same trade routes that spread wealth and ideas, could accomplish what no invading army ever could. It could hollow out an empire from within, leaving its institutions standing but utterly emptied of their strength. It is a sobering reminder of our enduring vulnerability to nature's smallest actors, a biological shadow that would stretch across centuries, waiting to be cast once more. Sometimes history's most profound collapses happen in concert. In the span of a single human lifetime, roughly from 1200 to 1150 before the Common Era, the entire political and economic world of the Eastern Mediterranean shattered. The mighty Hittite Empire in Anatolia, a superpower that rivaled Egypt, vanished from the historical record. The new Kingdom of Egypt, though it survived, was battered and permanently diminished, retreating from its imperial holdings. The prosperous mercantile city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was burned and never reoccupied, and as we have seen, the Mycenaean palaces in Greece fell silent. This was not a series of unrelated local tragedies. It was a single, sprawling event, the Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of history's most compelling mysteries, a case study in how interconnectedness can become a vector for catastrophe. The unraveling began with the sky. Tree ring and sediment core data from across the region paint a picture of a severe, multi-decade drought. For agricultural societies living on the razor's edge of subsistence, this was a disaster in slow motion. Crops failed, herds died, and famine began to stalk the land. This environmental stress created a desperate, mobile population, people with nothing left to lose. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions vividly and fearfully document the arrival of these groups, collectively labeled the Sea Peoples. They were likely not a unified army but a chaotic wave of displaced communities, climate refugees armed with whatever they could carry, moving along the coasts in search of food and land. They were both a symptom of the wider collapse and a catalyst for its acceleration, overwhelming weakened kingdoms that could no longer defend their borders. But the assault on civilization came from every direction. The geological record shows a startling frequency of major earthquakes during this period, seismic events that would have toppled palace walls, disrupted water supplies, and shattered the confidence of populations who might have seen the very ground shaking as a sign of divine abandonment. Internally, the social contract frayed under the strain. A starving peasantry is rarely a loyal one, and evidence suggests uprisings and a loss of faith in the ruling elite, whose divine mandate to ensure prosperity was clearly broken. Perhaps the most decisive blow, however, was the silent death of international trade. The Bronze Age world was a globalized system, critically dependent on long-distance exchange. Copper came from Cyprus, tin from as far away as Afghanistan, essential for forging the bronze that gave the age its name. This intricate network relied on stability, on treaties between kings, and on safe sea lanes. As drought sparked migration and migration sparked conflict, those sea lanes became perilous. Ports were destroyed, merchant ships ceased their voyages, and the flow of vital goods ceased. A kingdom could survive a bad harvest if it had the wealth to import grain, but it could not survive if its currency, bronze, could no longer be made because the tin trade had evaporated. The loss of this complex economic web meant that local crises could no longer be mitigated. They became terminal. This is the essence of the perfect storm. No single factor, not the drought, not the migrations, not the earthquakes, nor the trade collapse, would likely have been enough to topple every major state across such a vast region. But together, they created a feedback loop of doom. Drought caused famine, which spurred migration, which led to conflict, which destroyed trade, which prevented recovery from famine, which invited more rebellion. Each failing system placed unbearable strain on the others until the entire international order buckled and fell. The brilliant palaces, the diplomatic correspondence on clay tablets, the far-flung trade routes, all gave way to a simpler, poorer, and far more isolated age. The Bronze Age collapse stands as a hauntingly relevant lesson, a warning that our own deeply interconnected world, for all its strength, creates pathways for risk where a crisis in one corner can rapidly become a crisis for all. The Moai statues of Rapa Nui stand with their backs to the sea, gazing eternally inland. Their creation is one of humanity's most staggering achievements, a feat of artistry, engineering, and communal will on the most isolated inhabited island on Earth. Yet their silent vigil overlooks a landscape that tells a second, far more cautionary tale. When Dutch explorers first made contact in the 18th century, they did not find the thriving society that had carved and moved these colossal figures. They encountered a much smaller population living on a barren, treeless island, a place that seemed to have exhausted its own life force. The story of Rapa Nui has become a haunting parable about the limits of an isolated world. For centuries, the Polynesian settlers flourished. They built a complex society organized around clan groups, each vying for prestige and divine favor. This competition found its ultimate expression in the Moai, the massive stone ancestors erected on ceremonial platforms. The drive to create larger and more impressive statues, however, came with an immense physical cost. Moving a multi-ton block of volcanic rock across miles of rugged terrain required an incredible amount of timber. Researchers believe the islanders used a system of wooden sledges, rollers, and levers, felling the island's lush palm forests generation after generation to fuel this cultural obsession. It was a slow, incremental process, a choice made year after year that seemed to promise status and spiritual security. But with each tree cut, the island's ecological foundation grew weaker. The consequences of complete deforestation were catastrophic and interconnected. Without tree roots to hold the thin soil in place, tropical rains washed away the fertile land, devastating agriculture. The loss of tall trees meant no timber for building the large, seaworthy canoes essential for deep-sea fishing, severing a critical protein source. The society that had turned its energy inward toward monumental art suddenly found itself trapped. They were prisoners on their own island, surrounded by a vast ocean they could no longer navigate, watching their food sources dwindle. The archaeological record suggests what followed was a period of immense hardship and social unraveling. With survival at stake, competition between clans likely turned from ceremonial rivalry into violent conflict over the remaining resources. The once sacred moai were toppled, perhaps as acts of warfare against a rival clan's ancestral power. Oral traditions and some archaeological interpretations point to a period of severe social breakdown. The narrative that emerged for modern audiences was stark, a civilization that literally chopped down its own future, collapsing under the weight of its cultural ambitions. More recent scholarship adds crucial nuance, suggesting that the arrival of Europeans and the diseases and exploitation they brought played a significant role in the final population decline. Yet the core ecological lesson remains profoundly resonant. Whether the primary driver or a major contributing factor, the story of Rapa Nui illustrates with terrible clarity how a society, isolated by geography and focused on a singular goal, can inadvertently cross an environmental threshold from which there is no return. It is a study in the unintended consequences of success, a reminder that no civilization, no matter how ingenious, operates independently from the natural systems that sustain it. Their silent stone giants now serve as monuments to a different question, not just who built them, but what happens when a world turns in on itself and consumes its own foundations. Deep in the jungle, a king's promise turned to dust. The classic Maya civilization, with its soaring pyramids, precise calendars, and complex written language, represents one of the ancient world's most spectacular intellectual achievements. Yet between the 8th and 9th centuries, the heart of this civilization in the southern lowlands simply stopped beating. Great cities like Tikal, Palenque, and Kapan, once bustling centers of ceremony and commerce, were gradually reclaimed by the forest. This was not a sudden invasion or a single cataclysm, but a slow, grinding halt known as the Maya hiatus, a classic example of how environmental pressure can unravel even the most intricate social contract. The evidence for the primary driver is locked in stone, deep within the caves of the Yucatan Peninsula. Scientists analyzing stalagmites, those stone pillars that grow from cave floors, can read them like climate diaries. The layers of mineral deposit reveal a terrifying pattern, a series of intense, multi-year droughts that gripped the region for decades. For a civilization utterly dependent on seasonal rains to fill their reservoirs and nourish their maize fields, this was a disaster in slow motion. Imagine the growing dread as the skies remained empty season after season, as the water levels in the ceremonial reservoirs sank lower and lower. Crops withered in the fields, leading to widespread food shortages. The very basis of Maya life was under threat. This environmental stress acted like a magnifying glass, concentrating the heat on the civilization's existing fault lines. Maya society was organized as a network of rival city-states, each ruled by a Ku Ajor, a holy lord believed to be a direct intermediary with the gods. These kings derived their power from a sacred covenant. They performed rituals and shed their own blood to communicate with deities like Chok, the rain god, to ensure prosperity and timely rains for their people. When the rains failed year after punishing year, that covenant was broken. The king's divine authority, the very glue holding the social order together, began to dissolve. The result was a vicious cycle of desperation. As resources dwindled, warfare between city-states, always a feature of Maya politics, intensified from ritualized conflict into brutal struggles for survival, for the last arable land and the few reliable water sources. Inscriptions on stone monuments, which once recorded royal births and celestial events, began to tell darker tales of conquest and the capture of rival kings. Internally, the populace's faith fractured. Why should they continue to labor building monuments for a ruler who could no longer deliver the most basic necessity? The social contract evaporated. People did not vanish overnight, but they voted with their feet. There was a gradual, relentless migration away from the grand southern cities. The focus of Maya culture shifted northward to places like Chichen Itza, where different water sources like accessible cenotes or natural sinkholes offered a more reliable lifeline. The brilliant classic system, with its divine kings and concentrated urban power, fragmented. What remained was a transformed society, a cultural persistence but a political eclipse. The story of the Maya hiatus is a profound lesson in the fragility of belief. It shows that a civilization can be brought low not just by a lack of water, but by the evaporation of the faith that holds its hierarchy together. When the gods seemed to turn away, the people eventually turned away from the kings who could no longer speak to them, leaving their stone testimonies to be silenced by the very jungle they once sought to master. The fate of the world's first empire was written in dust. Sargon of Akkad achieved what no ruler before him had, unifying the independent city-states of ancient Mesopotamia into a single, sprawling dominion around the year 2334 before the Common Era. His was the original template for imperial power, a model of centralized control that would echo for millennia. Yet this groundbreaking experiment lasted less than 2 centuries before it violently shattered. For years, historians pointed to internal rebellion or invasion as the cause, but the true answer was found far from the ruins of Mesopotamian palaces, deep beneath the sea. Scientists drilling sediment cores from the floor of the Gulf of Oman discovered a startling layer, a thick band of fine, wind-blown dust that could only have originated from the dry soils of Mesopotamia itself. This dust was not from a single sandstorm. It was the geological signature of a catastrophe, a centuries-long megadrought that began with shocking abruptness right at the time of the empire's collapse. The fertile northern heartland of the Akkadian Empire, the very breadbasket that fed its armies and administrators, was turning to dust. The trigger for this climatic shift may have come from a planet-altering event thousands of miles away. Evidence points to a massive volcanic eruption, possibly from Mount Etna in Sicily or another major site, that spewed enough ash and aerosols into the upper atmosphere to deflect sunlight and disrupt weather patterns across the globe. For Mesopotamia, a land dependent on the delicate balance of river floods and seasonal rains, the result was a death sentence. The rains failed, the Tigris and Euphrates ran lower, and the fields that once produced surplus grain baked under a relentless sun. Famine did not just bring hunger, it severed the bonds of empire. Outlying regions that had been conquered and compelled to send tribute to the central power in Akkad saw no reason to remain loyal when the central power could no longer feed them. Rebellions flared as provinces fought to control their own dwindling resources. The imperial administration, a brilliant innovation for its time, was designed to manage plenty, not scarcity. It could not maintain the roads, garrison the forts, or pay the soldiers when its agricultural tax base evaporated. The empire did not fall to a superior army. It contracted, withered, and then shattered from within under the stress of a changing sky. The story of Akkad is a foundational lesson in vulnerability. It demonstrates that from the very beginning, human ambition to build complex, large-scale societies has been at the mercy of global climatic forces far beyond any king's comprehension or control. Their collapse whispers a sobering truth across 4,000 years, that our greatest political and social structures are ultimately built upon the most fragile of foundations, the predictable rhythm of wind and rain. The Great Mound at Cahokia still rises from the Illinois floodplain, a silent pyramid in the American heartland. 1,000 years ago, this was the epicenter of a cultural explosion, a planned metropolis that at its peak around the year 1050 of the Common Era boasted a population of perhaps 20,000 people, rivaling contemporary London. This was the capital of the Mississippian world, a city of plazas, palisades, and over 120 earthen mounds, where a sophisticated society practiced astronomy, played a ritual ball game, and traded goods from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Yet by the middle of the 14th century, the city was empty, its grand plaza grown over with grass. The mystery of Cahokia's exodus is not one of invasion or sudden catastrophe, but of a slow, deliberate unwinding. The first blow likely came from the river that gave it life. Around the year 1200, geological evidence points to a massive flood event, one that would have inundated the low-lying residential districts and the vital agricultural fields along the riverbank. Imagine the aftermath not just of water damage, but of a profound disruption to the food supply and the social geography of the city. This environmental shock was compounded by another slow-burning crisis, resource depletion. Supporting such a dense urban population required an immense amount of protein. Over generations, the intensive hunting in the surrounding forests and wetlands would have dramatically reduced populations of deer, waterfowl, and other game, forcing people to range farther afield or rely more heavily on cultivated crops. Then the climate itself began to shift. The onset of what scholars call the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling, brought shorter, less reliable growing seasons to the American Midwest. For a society whose agricultural calendar revolved around the cultivation of maize, a crop sensitive to frost, even a slight cooling trend could mean the difference between a bountiful harvest and a precarious shortfall. These converging pressures, flood, scarcity, and a cooling climate, placed immense strain on the social fabric. The authority of the ruling elite, perhaps seen as intermediaries with spiritual forces that controlled the sun and rain, would have been tested as those forces seemed to turn against the community. Evidence from the archaeological record suggests a period of increasing social tension, possibly even conflict, as competition for dwindling resources intensified. The grand palisade wall built around the central precinct speaks to a need for security, a turning inward. It is in this context that we find perhaps the most telling clue about their end, not in violence but in choice. There is no evidence of a final, devastating attack. Instead, the story written in the soil is one of gradual departure. People made a collective decision that the urban experiment was no longer sustainable. They voted with their feet, clan by clan, family by family, dispersing from the great city to establish or join smaller, more resilient communities along the river's tributaries. They did not vanish, they simply reconfigured their society into a form better suited to the changing world. Cahokia's legacy, therefore, is not one of failure but of adaptation. Its story demonstrates that urbanism is not an irreversible step, but a strategy, one that can be set aside when the environmental and social costs become too high. The mounds remain not as tombstones, but as monuments to a bold experiment in city building, and to the pragmatic wisdom of knowing when to let the forest reclaim the plaza. Their story begins with a promise of green pastures. In the late 10th century, Norse explorers led by Eric the Red sailed west from Iceland, finding a land of deep fjords and grassy valleys along the southwestern coast. They called it Greenland, a name that was perhaps more hopeful marketing than strict geography, but during the medieval warm period, it held a kernel of truth. For several generations, the settlements thrived. The eastern and western settlements were not mere outposts, but functioning communities with stone churches, dairy farms, and a lifestyle transplanted directly from their Scandinavian homeland. Their identity was built on a specific package of European civilization, centered on pastoral farming. They raised cattle, a high-status symbol, and sheep, and they put enormous effort into harvesting hay to feed these animals through the winter. This was the core of their economy and their culture, a way of life that connected them spiritually and materially to the distant centers of Christendom in Norway and Iceland. Their survival depended on two fragile threads: a climate mild enough to grow sufficient fodder, and open seas to maintain trade for essential goods like iron, timber, and prestige items. Then the world grew colder. Beginning in the 13th century, the climate pendulum began its slow, relentless swing into what we now call the Little Ice Age. Average temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened, and the pack ice from the Arctic began to advance southward, creeping farther down the coast and staying longer each year. For the Norse, this was a multi-generational squeeze. The first thread to snap was the maritime lifeline. The increasing sea ice made the already perilous voyage to Iceland and Norway far more dangerous and unpredictable. The supply ships from the homeland, their vital connection to the broader world, became rare, then ceased altogether. They were utterly isolated. At the same time, their agricultural foundation was crumbling. The cooler summers produced less grass, meaning less hay could be stored. Winters grew longer and more severe, demanding more of that dwindling hay supply to keep their precious cattle alive. The livestock grew thin, their numbers fell, and the people who depended on them for milk, meat, and status faced chronic malnutrition. The land was still full of food, but it was food the Norse refused to eat. Just a short distance away, the Inuit people, ancestors of the modern Thule culture, were not just surviving but thriving in the same harsh conditions. Their technology and lifestyle were a perfect adaptation to the Arctic, centered on hunting ringed seals from kayaks in the winter fjords, fishing, and taking larger marine mammals like walrus. They wore tailored skins that provided superior insulation compared to wool, and their tools were crafted from bone and ivory. The archaeological record reveals a stark and telling divide. At Norse sites, we find the bones of their dwindling cattle and sheep. At contemporary Inuit sites, we find bones from a rich variety of seals, whales, and fish. The two cultures were aware of each other. There is evidence of some limited trade, but the Norse largely held themselves apart. To adopt the Inuit way of life would have meant more than learning new hunting skills. It would have required abandoning the very core of their identity, their European Christian culture, their social structure built around land and livestock, their notion of what constituted a proper meal and a proper life. This was a disaster not of a sudden cataclysm, but of a slow, stubborn refusal to change. As the centuries wore on, the combination of climatic stress, economic isolation, and nutritional decline likely led to a desperate end. The Western settlement vanished around the year 1350. The last written record of the Eastern settlement is a wedding recorded in the church at Valsey in 1408. After that, only silence. When a ship finally returned decades later, the explorers found only empty farms, scattered bones, and a few stray cattle running wild. The lesson of the Greenland Norse is uniquely poignant. It demonstrates that a civilization can possess all the intelligence and courage to settle a new world, yet lack the cultural flexibility to change its dreams when that world changes around it. Their fate asks us a difficult question: what core practices do we cling to today, not because they still work, but because they are who we believe we are? The story of Greenland is one of slow dissolution, but history also knows endings that arrive in a single, terrifying night. In the winter of 373 before the Common Era, the prosperous Greek city of Helike simply ceased to exist. A prominent member of the Achaean League and a revered center for the worship of Poseidon, god of the sea and earthquakes, Helike was a thriving hub of commerce and culture on the southern shore of the Corinthian Gulf. Then, without warning, the very deity they honored turned his power against them. Ancient writers like Pausanias recorded the event with a sense of awe and horror, describing how immense tremors shook the region, so violent they toppled every building. As the stunned survivors fled into the surrounding fields, a new terror emerged from the darkened gulf. A colossal wave, a tsunami generated by the seabed's violent displacement, rushed inland. When the waters finally receded, the city of Helike was gone, not just damaged but completely submerged beneath the sea. The destruction was so absolute, so thorough, that it passed from history into legend. For centuries, travelers would report seeing the ghostly outlines of buildings beneath the waves, and fishermen would speak of snagging their nets on submerged ruins. The city's precise location became a mystery, a cautionary tale about the wrath of the gods. It was not until the late 20th century that archaeologists, combining ancient texts with geological surveys, finally located its remains, not in the sea, but buried under layers of silt and gravel inland, confirming a cataclysm of land subsidence and tsunami that had literally wiped the city from the map. Helike stands as the starkest prototype of a sudden, single-event disaster. There was no period of decline, no chance for adaptation or migration. A vibrant, sophisticated community was erased between sunset and sunrise, leaving no survivors to tell its story firsthand. This event underscores a terrifying geological truth that has haunted coastal civilizations throughout time. The ground beneath our feet and the sea upon which we rely can transform in an instant from sources of sustenance into instruments of oblivion. In our modern world of dense coastal cities, the fate of Helike is not merely an archaeological curiosity. It is a sobering reminder of the immense, silent forces that still shape our planet and the fragile line between a bustling port and a forgotten myth. The ash cloud from Thera did not stop at the shores of Crete. When a volcano erupts with that much force, it does more than bury an island. It changes the sky for the entire planet. The immense plume of sulfur dioxide and fine particles shot high into the stratosphere, where winds carried them across the globe. This veil of volcanic dust acted like a thin, gray shield, reflecting sunlight back into space and lowering average temperatures on Earth for several years. What the ancient world experienced was a volcanic winter, a period of failed summers and strange, cold years that would have been recorded not in history books, but in the withered stalks of grain and the empty stomachs of people who had no idea why their world had grown so cold. This climatic shockwave reached places that had never heard of the Minoans or the Aegean Sea. In the valleys of the Yellow River, Chinese chronicles from the later Shang dynasty hint at periods of climatic distress and social upheaval around this same time. While direct causation is difficult to prove, the timing is strikingly coincidental, suggesting that a harvest crisis triggered by global cooling could have fueled the instability that often precedes dynastic change. Far to the west in Egypt, the timeline is even more compelling. The eruption of Thera occurred right at the beginning of a deeply troubled era known as the Second Intermediate Period, a time when the unified Egyptian state fragmented and foreign rulers, the Hyksos, took control of the northern Nile Delta. While many factors contributed to this collapse, a sudden, multi-year climatic downturn would have been a catastrophic stressor. The Nile's annual flood, the predictable heartbeat of Egyptian civilization, relied on stable rainfall patterns in distant highlands. A volcanic winter disrupting those patterns could have led to a series of low, inadequate floods, resulting in famine, a loss of faith in the pharaoh's divine mandate to maintain cosmic order, and a vulnerability that invaders could exploit. Revisiting Thera from this planetary vantage point transforms our understanding of the disaster. It was not merely a regional tragedy that ended one civilization. It was a global climate event that acted as a hidden trigger, exacerbating tensions and straining food systems in vulnerable societies thousands of miles apart. A farmer in China or Egypt, shivering through a summer frost and watching his crops die, would have blamed local gods or a failing king. He would never have known that the true source of his hardship was a mountain that had exploded on an island far across the world. This invisible connection reveals a profound truth about our ancient past and indeed our present. Long before globalization, human societies were already linked by the thin, shared blanket of the atmosphere. An event in one corner of the globe could send silent, climatic ripples across continents, toppling kingdoms that never knew its name. It is a humbling reminder of our enduring dependence on planetary systems far beyond our control, where the true scale of a disaster is measured not just in local ruins, but in the unseen threads of cause and effect that weave the entire human story together. The planet itself changed its rhythm, while the collapse of palaces and trade routes feels like a human story. Its deepest roots reach into the chemistry of ancient ice and the rings of long-felled trees. Scientific data from across the globe tells a startling story. Around 1200 before the Common Era, the world entered a prolonged chill. This was the late Bronze Age cold epoch, a climatic shift so significant it forms the vast, invisible stage upon which our entire list of disasters unfolds. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica preserved tiny bubbles of the ancient atmosphere, revealing a sudden spike in volcanic sulfates right at this time. Great eruptions, perhaps from Hekla in Iceland or other volcanoes now quiet, pumped sun-blocking particles high into the stratosphere. The result was a planetary cool-down that lasted not for years but for generations. This was not merely a bad season or a local drought. It was a fundamental alteration of the basic conditions for life across continents. In the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, where empires like the Hittites and Assyrians depended on predictable rains, the cooler air held less moisture. The rains grew sparse and unreliable. In the rocky fields of Greece, where Mycenaean farmers grew barley and olives, shorter, cooler summers meant crops often failed to ripen. Even in the valleys of the Yangtze River, far from the Mediterranean world, archaeological evidence suggests periods of social upheaval coinciding with this global climatic stress. The impact was a slow, grinding pressure. A shortened growing season does not destroy a city in a day. Instead, it reduces the surplus, the vital cushion that feeds artisans, soldiers, and scribes. Year after lean year, the granaries would have held less. Populations grew hungry, and hungry people are far less likely to obey distant kings or remain content with their lot. This persistent environmental hardship became the kindling for every other spark. When the harvest fails, a king cannot pay his army, making his borders porous. Desperate communities might take up raiding, becoming the marauders later called the Sea Peoples. Long-distance trade, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age, becomes a perilous luxury when every city is hoarding its own dwindling food supplies. The Cold Epoch did not cause the rebellions or sink the merchant ships directly. Instead, it created a world of scarcity where those events became inevitable. It squeezed the resilience out of complex societies, making them brittle. A kingdom could survive an invasion if it were well-fed and united. It could survive a trade disruption if its fields were bursting with grain. But no civilization, no matter how brilliant, could withstand the combined assault of famine, migration, and economic collapse when its environmental foundation was crumbling beneath it. This is why this climatic shift stands as the ultimate ancient disaster. It was a force of nature operating on a scale no human ruler could comprehend or counter. It reset the trajectory of human history from the Aegean to the Indus, not with a bang, but with a long, silent winter that starved the roots of empires. It is the humbling backdrop to all that followed, a reminder that the rise and fall of our greatest endeavors is always, ultimately, a conversation with the sky. From the ash of Thera to the silent cities of the Maya, a pattern emerges from the dust. These 15 stories scattered across continents and millennia are not isolated tragedies. They are different verses of the same sobering song, a reminder that human civilization is a grand, ongoing experiment conducted on a dynamic and often unforgiving planet. We build our towers and plant our fields on a stage that is never truly still. The ground can shake, the sky can withhold its rain, and microscopic life can travel the very trade routes we create. These are the forces that have always been part of the contract. What these ancient endings teach us is that collapse rarely comes from a single external blow. More often, it arrives through a convergence of pressures, where environmental change exposes social rigidities, where economic networks fail just as they are needed most, and where a society's own vision of itself can become a trap that prevents adaptation. The Maya kings could not command the clouds to return. The Norse of Greenland could not bring themselves to learn from their Inuit neighbors. The intricate web of Bronze Age trade could not survive when every kingdom was fighting for its own survival. These are lessons in complexity and fragility, yet to see these stories only as tales of doom is to miss their deeper resonance. They are also profound studies in human resilience. The people of the Indus Valley did not vanish, they dispersed and transformed. The ancestral Puebloans chose migration over extinction, carrying their culture to new lands. Even in total catastrophe, the human impulse to persist, to remember, and to rebuild is woven through the aftermath. These civilizations left behind more than ruins. They left a legacy of questions for us to answer. In our modern world, the threads that connect us are infinitely more dense and fast-moving than the tin trade of the Bronze Age or the monsoon winds of the Khmer. Our climate is changing, our resources are strained, and our systems are interconnected on a global scale. The ancient disasters challenge us to look at our own world with clear eyes. They ask us, what are our rigidities, where are our points of greatest vulnerability, and most importantly, how can we cultivate the wisdom and flexibility to adapt? The historian Will Durant once observed that civilization exists by geological consent, subject to change without notice. Our journey through these lost worlds is a call to respect that fragile consent, to understand the ground upon which we build, and to remember that our greatest achievements are always in dialogue with the natural world. If these historical echoes have given you a new perspective, consider subscribing for more explorations into the mysteries of our shared past. We would love to hear your thoughts. Which of these ancient disasters do you find most compelling for our world today? Share your reflections in the comments below.